The candlelight flickered across Grandpa Whitfield's portrait as forks clinked against china. My son Mark stood at the center of our family dining table, unfolding a printed statement with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "Mother," he began, his voice steady and cold. "Effective immediately, you're retired from Whitfield Construction." The words hung in the air like smoke. 50 years of mornings that started at dawn, of concrete dust in my hair, of blueprints spread across kitchen tables, dismissed in a single sentence. My chest tightened, but my hands stayed folded in my lap. I breathed once, measured and slow. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I built this company from a single truck and a dream when I was 23 years old." The silence stretched across the table. Cousin Clara stared at her plate. Uncle Bernard cleared his throat but said nothing. Mark's wife Olivia smiled like she was watching a play she'd already seen. Her parents, Teresa and Harold, exchanged a satisfied glance from across the table. Mark sat down, looking smug and certain. Convinced he'd won, plates were pushed away. But nobody moved to leave. Every eye in that room scanned my face, waiting for tears or shouting or some display that would confirm their expectations. My hands remained folded, steady as stone. That's when Cousin Clara surprised me. She set down her wine glass with deliberate force and said quietly, "This isn't right." Her voice was small, but it cracked the silence. Mark's jaw tightened. Olivia's smile flickered for just a moment before returning, wider and more theatrical than before. She was performing for someone, I realized. For her parents, probably. Teresa leaned forward slightly, her diamond necklace catching the light. Harold nodded once, satisfied with the evening's outcome. At the far end of the table, my nephew Daniel whispered to his father, "You should have stepped in, Dad." The remark hung there, accusatory and uncomfortable. But his father, my brother, said nothing. Just stared at his dessert fork like it held answers. The family had made their choice. They'd watched Mark humiliate me and chosen silence. Later that night, alone in my study, memories flooded back. I was 23 again, standing in front of a banker who didn't believe women could run construction companies. I remembered the smell of fresh concrete the day I signed my first mortgage, the weight of that loan pressing on my shoulders like physical stone. I'd driven a pickup truck for 5 years before I could afford to hire anyone. Every contract was written in longhand in a leather ledger book I still kept in my desk drawer. Every foundation I poured was a promise kept. Pride and fatigue collided in my chest as I sat there in the dark. But those memories weren't just nostalgia. They were evidence. Because 6 months ago, when I first noticed Mark's distance and Olivia's calculating questions about company structure, I'd started writing new contracts and trust language. I'd worked with my oldest friend and business partner, Alan Pierce, in complete privacy. In one flashback moment that still felt vivid, I handed Alan a sealed folder and said simply, "Keep this sealed until I say." Alan had nodded without questions. He trusted me. 6 months earlier, Mark had hosted a corporate mixer at the downtown hotel. I'd watched from the bar as he worked the room, shaking hands with investors, promising them modernization and growth. His suit was expensive, his haircut sharp. He looked nothing like the boy who used to bring me coffee on job sites. "My mother built something remarkable," he'd told a group of potential backers, "but it's time for Whitfield Construction to enter the modern age." The words sounded reasonable, progressive even, but there was something underneath them that felt like dismissal. Olivia stood beside him, radiant in red, whispering to her mother when she thought no one was watching. "We'll protect the name," I'd heard her say. Protect it from what? From me. Later that evening, I'd seen Mark glance at his phone. The screen showed a calendar entry that made my stomach drop. Legacy dinner, finalize. That's when I knew. This wasn't about business evolution. It was about removal. My removal. I'd driven home that night and called my attorney why other 2 children had always been different from Mark. Lucy, my youngest, was protective but scared of confrontation. Ethan, the middle child, had moved to another state and built a life of careful distance from family drama. The day after the mixer, I'd invited them both to coffee. Lucy's eyes pleaded with me before she even sat down. "Mom, just let it happen," she whispered. "Fighting Mark will tear the family apart." Ethan stirred sugar into his coffee and wouldn't meet my gaze. "I'm staying out of it," he said flatly. "This is between you and Mark." I'd felt the weight of their choices then. Lucy would stand with me if I truly needed her, but it would cost her. Ethan wouldn't stand with anyone. He'd already decided that neutrality was safer than loyalty. As we left the coffee shop, Lucy pulled out her phone with a determined expression, as if she'd made some internal decision. Ethan walked to his car without looking back. Family loyalties, I learned that day, were conditional, not guaranteed. 3 months before the dinner, I'd sat in my attorney's office reviewing trust documents. Margaret Brennan had been practicing law for 30 years and knew every loophole in corporate structure. "Eleanor," she'd said, spreading papers across her desk, "this trust places operational control contingent on several triggers. If the board determines that leadership transition violates the company charter or original founding principles, control defaults back to the trust holder." I'd felt relief wash over me then. Not paranoia but prudence. The legal shield was sound. "The beauty of this," Margaret continued, "is that you don't have to fight. The structure fights for you." I'd studied the clauses carefully. Everything was ironclad. The trust required board assessment of any major leadership change. It required adherence to the founding charter I'd written 40 years ago. Most importantly, it gave my business partner Alan the authority to call for ownership verification if charter violations occurred. I signed the documents and told no one. Not Lucy, not Ethan, not even Clara. Silence was my strategy. 2 months before the dinner, I'd attended a board meeting to test the temperature. I asked calm, measured questions about quarterly projections and contractor relationships. The board members exchanged sideways glances. Mark interrupted me twice, speaking over my questions with his own agenda items. The board deferred to him both times. I'd watched their body language carefully, the way they leaned toward Mark, the way they nodded at his suggestions before he'd finished making them. They'd already shifted their allegiance. At the end of the meeting, a quiet vote was scheduled for the following week. Nobody told me what the vote was about, but I knew. They were going to formalize Mark's leadership position. I left the boardroom that day with a small, unreadable smile. Let them vote. Let them feel certain. The trust documents I'd signed were already filed with the state. Legal scaffolding was already in place. They just didn't know it yet. Sometimes patience is the sharpest weapon you have. I'd learned that building foundations, you prepare the ground long before you pour concrete. 1 month before the dinner, the town held a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a community center Whitfield Construction had built. I'd expected to give the speech, as I'd done for 40 years. Instead, Mark stood at the podium while I sat in the second row. He talked about innovation and progress and the future of Whitfield Construction without once mentioning the past. Without mentioning me. The humiliation was sharper than anything that would happen at the dinner. This was public. This was the community I'd built alongside, watching my son erase me in real time. After the ceremony, people approached me with awkward sympathy. "You must be so proud," they said, as if I'd willingly stepped aside. That evening, a local reporter texted me a photo from the event. The caption read, "Who's replacing you at the table?" I stared at that photo for a long time. Mark at the podium, confident and polished. Me in the audience, diminished. The reporter's question was innocent, but it cut deep. The town was already wondering. Already assuming my time was finished. Saved the photo. Evidence accumulates in small moments. The weeks leading up to the dinner, I practiced patience like meditation. Every morning, I reminded myself that revenge built on emotion crumbles. Revenge built on legal foundation lasts. I wasn't interested in shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. I was interested in timing, in strategy, in letting Mark's certainty become his weakness. During those weeks, I signed small documents that transferred specific delegated rights. I moved certain assets into the trust structure Margaret had designed. I made sure every signature, every legal filing, every structural change was documented and dated. Alan called me weekly with updates. Investors were nervous about Mark's aggressive expansion plans. The board was starting to ask questions about capital allocation. Cracks were forming in Mark's confident facade, but he was too focused on the dinner to notice. On the night before the dinner, I placed a final call to Alan. "Tomorrow," I said simply. He understood. Everything was ready. The trap had been built carefully, invisibly. All that remained was for Mark to step into it. Alan and I met at an old diner on the edge of town the morning of the dinner. We'd been business partners for 32 years, and our friendship ran deeper than contracts. He slid into the booth across from me and smiled. "The backers are ready to honor the trust," he said quietly. "They've reviewed the charter violations in Mark's restructuring plans. They prefer your stewardship to the gamble Mark represents." I felt something loosen in my chest. This wasn't just legal maneuvering anymore. It was validation. Alan continued, he caught himself. "Victor Lawrence and his investment group will be in the boardroom tomorrow morning at 9. They want to meet with you directly. Not Mark. You." I nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that statement. The major investors who'd been courted by Mark for months had chosen me instead. "Be there," Alan said, finishing his coffee. "They're expecting you." I left that diner feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly. Something sturdier than hope. Certainty. The pieces were moving into place. The family dinner invitation had arrived in everyone's mailbox a week earlier. Elegant cream cardstock with embossed lettering. "Celebrate Eleanor Whitfield, a legacy of excellence." I'd opened mine and studied the wording carefully. Mark had written it himself, I could tell from the phrasing. It was generous on the surface, honoring on paper. But underneath was performance. Theater. The guest list told its own story. Everyone had RSVP'd yes. Aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to attend my celebration. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They were gathering to honor the woman they were helping to remove. That evening Mark had texted Olivia. "Tonight's the night." I only knew because Lucy had seen the message when Olivia left her phone unattended at a family gathering. Lucy had photographed it and sent it to me without comment. Just evidence. Just truth. I'd prepared my outfit carefully that night. Simple black dress, minimal jewelry, comfortable shoes. I wanted to look dignified, not desperate. Professional, not emotional. I arrived early and watched as guests filed in, each one bringing their own agenda to my supposed celebration. The dinner began with toasts. Uncle Bernard raised his glass to friendship. Cousin Clara toasted memory. Harold, Olivia's father, toasted Whitfield tradition with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The room felt warm briefly. Nostalgic even. Then the warmth sharpened into something else. Anticipation. Everyone could sense the spectacle coming. On the head table sat a framed proclamation, in honor of Eleanor Whitfield, founder, leader, inspiration. The frame was expensive, the calligraphy professional. It looked like something you'd hang in a lobby after someone died. Mark stood then, not to toast but to speak. The room fell silent. He didn't look at me as he unfolded his prepared statement. His voice was steady, rehearsed. "We gather tonight to honor my mother's incredible contributions," he began, "and to announce that, effective immediately, she will be retiring from active leadership of Whitfield Construction." The words landed like stones. Some family members gasped. Others nodded as if they'd expected this. My hands remained folded in my lap. I took one slow sip of water. The camera of everyone's attention stayed fixed on my face. Waiting for reaction, Mark continued reading his statement, framing my retirement as benevolence. As if he were granting me rest after decades of hard work. As if this were a gift instead of removal. "My mother has earned her peace," he said, his voice taking on a practiced warmth. "It's time for the next generation to shoulder the responsibility she's carried so long." Olivia beamed at him from her seat. Teresa clapped softly, theatrically, like this was a performance she'd been waiting to see. The silence in the room felt heavy, held like breath. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. A few looked hungry, as if they were calculating what Mark's leadership might mean for their own positions in the family hierarchy. I watched it all with the detachment of someone observing a play. Lucy's jaw was tight with restrained anger. Ethan stared at his plate, refusing to look at anyone. Clara met my eyes briefly and shook her head. Disappointment, maybe, or solidarity. When Mark finally sat down, triumphant, the family resumed dinner as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Conversations restarted. Forks clinked. Someone laughed at a joke. The performance of normalcy was almost impressive. Old relatives who owed me favors, who'd borrowed money, who'd gotten jobs through my connections, who'd been bailed out of financial mistakes by my generosity, did nothing. They ate their salmon and drank their wine and pretended they hadn't just watched my public humiliation. Uncle Bernard, who I'd lent $50,000 to when his business failed, studied his bread plate. Aunt Patricia, whose son I'd hired despite his complete lack of qualifications, suddenly found the floral centerpiece fascinating. The betrayal compounded with each minute of silence. These weren't strangers. These were people who'd called me family for decades. People who'd celebrated at my table, who'd asked for help and received it without question. Now they sat silent and complicit while Mark erased me. Lucy's hands were clenched into fists under the table. I could see her knuckles white against her lap. Ethan had pushed his chair back slightly, physically distancing himself from the table. From me. From all of it. Mark accepted congratulations from Teresa and Harold. Olivia whispered something in his ear that made him smile. The family dinner continued as if my life's work hadn't just been publicly dismantled. I left the table quietly. No dramatic exit, no tears, no speech. I simply stood, smoothed my dress and said, "Thank you for coming." My voice was measured, steady. Some people looked confused by my composure. Others looked almost disappointed, as if they'd wanted the spectacle of my breakdown. I walked out of that dining room with my dignity intact and drove away without calling anyone. The night was clear and cold. I drove through town slowly, passing the buildings Whitfield Construction had built. The library, the medical center, the school addition, the community center where Mark had given his speech. I stopped at the bridge overlooking the valley where the town spread out below me. Lights twinkled in windows of homes I'd helped build. This was the town I'd built alongside, the community I'd invested in. And they just watched Mark take it from me without protest. I stood there for a long time, the cold air sharp in my lungs. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow the real work begins. Tonight was theater. Tomorrow would be justice. The next morning I went to my office early. The building was quiet, empty. I unlocked the safe deposit box I kept in the back filing cabinet and retrieved the sealed envelope I'd prepared months ago. Inside were copies of the trust documents, the company charter, and a formal letter to the board citing specific violations of founding principles in Mark's restructuring plans. My hands were steady as I prepared the mailing. This was the legal trigger Margaret and I had designed. The trust contained clauses that activated automatically if certain conditions were met: board vacancy filled without proper charter review, hostile succession that violated founding principles, or operational control transferred without trustee approval. Mark's announcement at dinner had met all three conditions. I mailed the notice with delivery confirmation, knowing it would reach the board by end of business day. The mechanics of legal control were beginning to show themselves, slowly and inevitably. That afternoon, I received confirmation that the documents had been delivered and signed for. There was no going back now. The legal process was in motion. Tomorrow's board meeting would be very different from what Mark expected. Mark entered the boardroom the next morning expecting support and congratulations. He wore a new suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the hard part was over. The board members greeted him warmly. Handshakes, smiles, comments about the previous night's dinner. He was being welcomed as the newly minted leader of Whitfield Construction. Then Mark saw Alan already seated at the table. His smile faltered briefly. Alan wasn't supposed to be there. At least not as far as Mark knew. Alan had copies of the trust documents stacked neatly in front of him. Official papers with legal seals and Margaret's law firm letterhead. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Board members exchanged uncertain glances. Mark sat down slowly, his confidence flickering. "Good morning, Mark," Alan said calmly. "Before we begin, I think we should review the company charter and trust structure. There are some procedural questions about last night's announcement." Someone at the far end of the table cleared their throat. "We should review the company charter," they agreed. The boardroom door closed with a heavy, final sound. Mark's triumphant morning was becoming something else entirely. Alan stood and addressed the room with quiet authority. He wasn't supplicant or subordinate. He was equal. A founding partner speaking with the weight of decades and documents. The trust established by Eleanor Whitfield contained specific clauses regarding leadership transition, he began. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. Any major operational change requires board assessment for charter compliance. Last night's announcement violated several procedural requirements. Mark's face changed. Confusion first, then the beginning of panic. "What are you talking about?" he interrupted. "That dinner was approved." "The dinner was approved," Alan agreed. "The announcement of forced retirement without board review was not." He opened the first document. According to the trust structure filed 6 months ago, majority operational control defaults to the trust holder if leadership transition fails charter compliance tests. The room went very quiet. Board members leaned forward to study the documents Alan was distributing. Olivia, seated behind Mark in the gallery section, reached for his hand and found it shaking. Alan looked directly at me then and said clearly, "Eleanor, would you like to speak?" Every head in that boardroom turned. I stood slowly, gathered my papers, and walked to the front of the room. Mark's face transformed as I approached the table. For the first time since announcing my retirement, he looked genuinely uncertain. Of script. Vulnerable. "Mother," he started, but his voice cracked on the word. I didn't sit down. I stood at the head of the table. My table, the one I'd sat at for 40 years, and addressed the board calmly. The trust structure Alan mentioned was designed to protect Whitfield Construction's founding principles. Those principles include adherence to ethical contracting practices, community investment requirements, and leadership accountability to the charter. I placed my documents on the table. Mark's restructuring plans, which several of you have reviewed, violate at least 3 charter provisions. The trust gives me authority to halt operational changes that compromise the company's foundation. Olivia stood suddenly in the back. "This is manipulation," she said, her voice sharp. "You're punishing Mark because he violated the charter," I finished calmly. "This isn't personal. It's procedural." A board member raised his hand tentatively. "If that's the case, we should vote to affirm proper leadership structure pending charter review." Another nodded in agreement. Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the floor. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. But the room had already shifted. The board voted unanimously to temporarily freeze any new leadership appointments pending complete charter review. The vote was formal, legal, final. Mark stood there watching his momentum collapse in real time. The confidence he'd carried into the room had evaporated entirely. Alan continued, reading from the trust documents with careful precision. "The trust's control clause empowers the business partner, myself, to call for ownership verification with Eleanor Whitfield as key signatory. Given the charter violations identified, I'm formally requesting that verification process begin immediately." Another vote. Another unanimous decision. Mark's hands were trembling now. He looked at the board members who'd smiled at him an hour ago, who'd welcomed him as their new leader. Now they wouldn't meet his eyes. "This isn't over," Mark said finally, his voice strained. "You can't just, my lawyers will." He didn't finish. Instead, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed toward the door. His face flushed with anger and humiliation. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing in the quiet boardroom. Olivia followed him out, her heels clicking rapidly on the tile floor. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Alan looked at me and nodded once. The beginning of justice. Within hours, Harold and Teresa were scrambling. Their confidence from the dinner had transformed into something like fear. Harold made frantic calls to his attorneys, his voice carrying down the office hallway. Teresa sat in the waiting area, her expensive handbag clutched in her lap, looking hunted. Their position had been clear at the dinner. They'd backed Mark's play completely, probably with promises of influence and financial benefit. Now that play was collapsing and they were exposed. Later that afternoon, I learned from Alan that Teresa had taken out a substantial personal loan years ago, one she'd kept hidden from Harold. The loan had been used to cover investment losses, and the lender was connected to one of Whitfield Construction's suppliers. If Mark lost control of the company, that relationship would be scrutinized. Teresa's careful social standing would crumble under the weight of financial scandal. When she learned that detail had surfaced in the charter review, I watched through the office window as she pressed her hand over her mouth, her face pale. The proud, satisfied woman from the dinner was gone. In her place was someone calculating how much she stood to lose. 2 days after the board meeting, Mark cornered me in the hallway outside my office. His anger had softened into something more desperate. "Mom," he said, and this time his voice carried real emotion. "Please. I made a mistake. I see that now. Can't we work this out?" I looked at my son and saw the boy I'd raised alongside the man who'd tried to erase me. The combination was painful. "What would working it out look like to you, Mark?" I asked calmly. He fumbled for words. I could stay on in a leadership role. We could co-manage. I've learned. I understand now that I moved too fast. I considered him carefully. The desperation was real, but so was the calculation. He was trying to salvage something from the wreckage. "Here's what I'll offer," I said finally. "Prove you can run a division for 1 year. On paper. With accountability and transparency. Show me you understand what leadership actually requires, and we'll discuss your role then." Mark's face flickered between hope and frustration. "A year. 1 year," I confirmed. "Or nothing." He left without agreeing, convinced he could find another angle, another way to buy time or leverage influence. But the hallway door closed behind him with a sound like finality. The trust's clauses activated like clockwork. Margaret's legal design was flawless, every contingency planned, every loophole closed. The board had no legal path to block the trust's authority. All paperwork was clean, dated, properly filed. Within a week, Alan formally recognized me as the controlling voice of Whitfield Construction. The company's operational reins shifted back quietly, without spectacle, just legal authority asserting itself through proper channels. Harold learned during that week that his financial backing of Mark's expansion plans was tied to company stock now controlled under the trust. His investment wasn't lost, but it was frozen until charter review completed. His confidence shattered visibly. He called old investors for support and found doors closing. Reputation is built slowly and lost quickly. Teresa's social projects, the charity boards she chaired, the fundraising committees she led, began quietly withdrawing the Whitfield name from their materials. Not because anyone asked them to, but because association with family scandal made donors nervous. Mark was offered a consultancy role with no decision-making power, a face-saving gesture that would let him claim continued involvement. His pride refused it. He stormed out of that meeting and tried to slam a door that wouldn't open anymore. The family grappled privately with what had happened. Some pleaded with me to show mercy. Others begged Mark to apologize properly. A few refused to accept reality entirely, insisting that legal maneuvering couldn't overcome family bonds. But consequences don't care about refusal. Teresa's reputation in social circles deteriorated quickly. Whispers about hidden loans and financial deception spread through the community. Charity boards requested her resignation. The satisfied smile she'd worn at the dinner was gone, replaced by carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide her exhaustion. Harold stopped attending public events entirely. The proud, confident man who'd toasted Whitfield tradition, while watching Mark humiliate me, now avoided spaces where he might face questions. Investors reconsidered public association with his name. Several business partnerships quietly dissolved. Mark moved into a smaller apartment and took a position with a competing firm in another city. The job was legitimate but diminished. Junior management after years of expecting executive control. Olivia stayed with him initially, but rumors suggested their marriage was strained. The future they'd planned together, built on my removal, had disappeared. Sometimes pride is the most expensive thing you refuse to abandon. 1 year later, I walked the construction site of our newest project with my grandson at my side. He was 8 years old, curious about everything, asking questions about concrete and foundations and how buildings stayed standing. I showed him the same things I'd shown Mark decades ago. The difference was in how he listened. Lucy sat on the board now, in a role I'd designed specifically for her strengths: community liaison and ethical oversight. She'd found her voice during the crisis, and it was strong. Ethan had returned too, slowly. He'd shown up at a board meeting 6 months ago with genuine apologies and a real offer to shoulder responsibility. Not for power but for repair. The arrogant in-laws sent letters occasionally, asking for small favors, suggesting reconciliation. I didn't grant them. Some bridges once burned should stay ash. Mark and I spoke twice a year now. Brief, formal conversations about his progress in his new position. The relationship was damaged, maybe permanently. But it existed. That evening, standing on the land where Whitfield construction began, I thought about the dinner. About Mark's prepared statement and the family's complicit silence. About the moment I'd walked out with quiet dignity. I never raised my voice through any of it. Sometimes the loudest power is measured silence, and that silence rebuilt what nearly fell apart.